Hello, Dr. Rhoda. How are you today?
I am very well. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing with you again on Molinism. Um, and um, yeah, I don't know. I've had a good 2 weeks. Uh,
Good. I
and
hear you had a little break with your wife, taking a bit of a vacation.
yeah. When our youngest was at summer camp for 5 days, and our oldest is old enough to look after the house on her own. So my wife and I, for the first time in like uh, almost 18 years, we
Wow.
were able to get off just the two of us.
Wow,
Uh,
that must have been
for,
refreshing, huh?
it was it's like, wow, we got to do this every year now that we
Yeah, now
can.
that you get a chance to do it, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So our
So,
youngest is going off to summer camp next year, whether she wants to or not.
you are just going.
Yeah.
So if she's nice during the year, you can say it's a reward. If she's not, well, it's a punishment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So great. So listen, last time we met, we went over a few of your objections, seven problems with Molinism. I think we
Hmm.
went through seven, one through one, two, and three. I think, eh?
Yeah, we went to the first three. Those are
Yeah.
focusing mainly on sort of incom- inconsistency arguments. I argued uh, that the middle knowledge that Molinists want to say God has just doesn't exist because the very concept of middle knowledge is internally problematic. Then I argued that Molinism is internally inconsistent in another way, in that it wants to reconcile uh, meticulous divine providence, this idea that God orchestrates all the details of creation history, with a robust notion of creaturely freedom. And I argued that you can't have both. That the doctrine of providence actually rules out any robust sort of creaturely freedom. And then we talked about the grounding objection, which is basically that, okay, even if these middle knowledge conditionals that God supposedly has before deciding which world to create, even if those conditionals can exist, you still need, or it makes sense at least, to pose the question, why are these conditionals true and not some other conditionals? Since by the Molinist admission, they're all contingent truths. They're logically contingent. So Molinists really don't have an answer to that, but it's an objection that I think intuitively carries a lot of force.
I think so. I think also they it's they do want to keep to have their I don't remember how we say this in English, the they want to have their cake and eat it too. I guess that's
Hmm.
the expression in English.
Yeah,
And
the idea
so, but
you're holding your cake in one hand at the same time as you're eating the same cake. So you're trying
exactly.
to eat it and keep it for later, right? Well,
Yeah.
no.
In French, we have the goat and the goat and the cabbage. You can't have both.
Ah,
The
good
goat will
one.
eat the cabbage.
That's the goat will eat the cabbage. Yes, I like that.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely, and it seems there's a confusion. Let's maybe a few comments on this for perhaps listeners that just came in. But there seems to be confusion, I feel, in their mind about the difference between necessity and determinism, as if determinism could only be causal determinism, and uh, and even that is very constrained as a definition. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly important to tease apart these different words because, as you know, words like possibility and necessity, even words like certainty, admit of a variety of uses. With respect to possibility and necessity, there's a bunch of different like layers of possibility. At one level, you have what we might call like practical possibility and necessity. I mean, it's uh, you know because we've got this stream scheduled, it's not possible for me to be, you know, uh, uh, to go and see my mom
Yeah.
both at the same time. It's not that either of those is impossible. It's just I can't do both. Um, uh, uh, or then we talk what we call like causal possibility, or uh, more narrowly, you might think of this as physical possibility or nomological possibility. You know, like it's not possible for me to travel faster than the speed of light, given the laws of nature as they are. It's not possible for us to travel to the past, or to change the past, or to uh, it's not possible for us on our own strength to, you know, like jump over a two-story building or anything like that. I mean, you reach the limits of, you know, human physiology, or you know, of just what's possible in the way the world is structured. And then more strongly than that, you have what might be thought of as metaphysical possibility, and this might be, at least for those of us who are theists, could be cashed out perhaps in terms of God's omnipotence. You know, what things are such that God could bring them about. Uh, uh, um, so there are things that God could have done, but no longer can do. Right.
Yeah.
For example, now that God the Son has become incarnate as Jesus, he cannot become incarnate for a second time. Or well, hold on. I said that wrong. Uh, uh, he cannot now become incarnate for the first time
Exactly.
because he already did that, right? So
Yes.
but there was a time in the past before the incarnation that God could become incarnate for the first time. Just, you know, so it's something, the concept of which is not internally contradictory, but given the way the, you know, the actual past, uh, and what God has already done, it's not something that's doable again.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of thing that's metaphysically impossible, but you might say it's logically possible. Uh, so we have all these different like layers of possibility. When we talk about necessity, talk about possibility, there's also things like moral necessity, you know, or epistemic necessity, and words like certainty can be used in both an epistemic and a metaphysical or causal way. Uh, so
And if you're not careful, last time I kept using the expression argumentative definition, which was an error because of my French and English
mhm.
mind here. But I guess what I wanted to say was a definist fallacy, where you frame a definition in such a way as to win the debate without any argument, because you
Oh
just
yeah,
frame the definition in such a way that you win by default. And I
yeah,
guess it seems to me that uh, sometimes there's this kind of definite fallacy, willingly or unwillingly, where they want to keep necessity or to keep certainty. Even certainty is a big one, because they will all oftentimes equivocate between
uh-huh,
necessity and certainty. But if you take necessity, if you take certainty not as an epistemic, not in the epistemic definition, well,
uh-huh.
it's very close to being a now unpreventable.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
exactly. There's in one sense, when we say I am certain that, you're using a kind of an epistemic sense of certainty, where you're talking about your own personal degree of confidence that something is the case. Or, you know, I am certain that 2 + 2 = 4. Uh, 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 but when you say it is certain that, now we're conveying a different kind of certainty. We're saying, you know, which does arguably entail something like an objective necessity or determinism or something like that. You know, if I say it is certain that the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yeah, it's not merely epistemic. There's
Yeah,
something concrete about this certainty.
yeah, I'm saying something about the way the world is, and I'm saying essentially there is no chance of the sun's not rising tomorrow, right? I'm excluding that possibility, and so I am saying it's necessary in relation to the context, the physical or nomological context, or whatever you take that to be. So yeah.
And so, which is why I think that oftentimes it seems to me that Molinists will try to hide in this abstract possible world semantic, where it is possible in another world, therefore it's not a necessity. In another
Yeah,
abstract, imaginary world, and therefore it's not a necessity. When
yeah,
that's not what we're saying.
yeah. Right. That's something that came up in the last stream. Um, uh, I noted that really for Molinism, the only way, uh, well, uh, because they think of possible worlds as complete total histories, that specify all the details from beginning to end. Um, that once you choose a possible world, there's no room for contingency within that, right? Because all
Exactly.
the details are contained. They're included in that uh, specification of the world, right? Once you say, this possible world, you're specifying a complete history. So the only way you can accommodate contingency, which is a two-sided possibility in the system, is to uh, talk about, well, it could have been a different world. Like you have to think at the level of entire worlds and things like, well, this God could have created a different world rather than this world. Okay, yeah, but then all the contingency is really on God's side, right? God's the one who's choosing which world to create. But once God's made that choice, there's nothing left, all right? Because everything is specified in that choice,
Exactly.
and so there's no contingency left for you and me,
If I'm
which
not
is what.
mistaken, I'm sorry. If I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken, you were Thomas at one point.
Very briefly, I
So
flirted with Thomism for.
doesn't Aquinas say this, that contingency are only on man's part and not on God's part, as if there was this dual aspect to contingency? It seems I've read this somewhere, maybe in I think it was in
Uh, There is something like that goes back to Boethius,
yeah.
and it's picked up from him by other figures like Anselm and Aquinas and others, which is excuse, my dogs are barking at something.
That's fine.
I can't fully
Yeah.
control that, but
No, that's fine.
the so what Boethius says is that God can know the what's contingent in a necessary way. uh,
Talk about a
nah,
married bachelor.
yeah. How that's possible, it's not entirely clear,
I
but
think
he.
I read this in this is a book by Garrigou Lagrange, a French book that was translated in English on God, and this
Okay,
guy's a
yeah.
Thomist, and
Hmm.
that's I just remember this is where I read it. He mentions that for Aquinas, he believed that on God's view it was necessary, but on contingency were only contingent on man's understanding, which is again the same thing you were mentioning about Boethius, I guess.
Yeah,
So it's married bachelor.
I
Oh well,
I
from
think
God's
so.
point he's married, but from our point he's a bachelor.
Well, I think what follows, if if everything's got to be sort of necessary from God's point of view, then either there is no contingency, it's just a, say, perspectival illusion. It just, so it's an epistemic contingency, right? From our perspective, we don't know exactly how things are fated to go, and so we suppose that it could go this way and it could go that way.
And so we come back to compatibilism.
Yeah. So either there is no real contingency if from God's perspective everything is necessary, or God's perspective is not all inclusive. In other words, there are contingent things, but God just can't know them. And so God is just oblivious to contingent reality. So I don't know which way you want to go here, but it seems to me we've got a forced choice between universal necessitarianism, or like a modal collapse, or divine ignorance of contingent reality, right? You have to deny divine omniscience and even divine providential concern for anything contingent. I think both are disastrous, but take your pick if you want to go that route.
It's as if, how Paul will say, let every man, God be truthful and every man a liar. Mm-hmm. So I guess if from God's view everything is necessary, well, we're just wrong, and it is a modal collapse. There's no other way around. And it is perspectival, like you just said. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, this is, we could go really down in the weeds in this, I think, but it's such an important aspect of the discussion with our Molinist friend, because it seems that there's so much possibility for ambiguity in all these words being used and the way that they're being used, that sometimes we just either willingly or unwillingly speak past each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's always something to be alert to when you're having discussions between competing viewpoints.
Yeah, definitely. So next, so we were at the point 4, which was going back to your 7 problems of Molinism.
Yeah.
So the 4th point was implicit denial and of divine aseity and sovereignty. Well, I guess this is a good segue.
Would you like me to throw that up on the screen?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let me see how I share screen, and then I think I have it all queued up here. So, let me. Okay, right there. Does that
there? Yeah,
look
perfect. Yeah.
All right. So, so by MK information, I just mean the middle knowledge information. This is what God supposedly knows in virtue of having middle knowledge, right? Well, it's according to Molinism, this is metaphysically and logically contingent information, right? It's not sort of intrinsically necessary that these things be the way they are. And I said it's extrinsic to God. What I mean by that is, it's not the information isn't something that follows either from God's nature or from God's will or from anything else that's intrinsic to God, whatever that could be. It's information that God, as it were, just discovers. It's just like, okay, and has to submit to it, because on the Molinist account, this knowledge limits God's creative possibilities.
Yeah.
So the way this is expressed by Thomas Flint, who is a very well-regarded exponent of Molinism. He wrote the book on Molinism, essentially, is to say, okay, we start with this space of all logically possible worlds. Okay, it's a big space. A world is logically possible on this conception. Again, it includes a complete total history, but it's the only constraint is it's got to be internally consistent, right? So you've got, say, a world where there are unicorns and no leprechauns, say, and a world where there are leprechauns and no unicorns. And then there is our world where there are neither unicorns nor leprechauns, and just like all of the variations that you can imagine, hypothetical things. What if the way we perceive, like the colors, could our perceptual spectrum be reversed to where what we perceive as red was we perceived in this other world as blue, and what we perceived as blue we perceived as red. You can just like speculate about all the possible things that could be, that logically speaking could have been even slightly different, and each of those is going to obtain in some logically possible world, right? So you have this giant space of all these logical possibilities. The only constraint is internal consistency. Okay. Now, on the Molinist account, you add in this middle knowledge information. This adds another layer of constraint. And so what it does is it filters down that scope of logically possible worlds to a smaller group that Flint refers to as the feasible worlds. These are the worlds that are creatable by God, because they are not only internally consistent, but they are also compatible with God's middle knowledge information. Okay, so the thought is God comes upon somehow this middle knowledge information. He has to submit to it in the sense that it constrains what is absolutely possible for God. God cannot create a world that is inconsistent with this middle knowledge information, and he has no say at all about the content or existence of that information. So I think it follows from this that the Molinist God is therefore not sovereign over all of reality. That is, there is this body of information that God is not sovereign over, and yet it's contingent information. And he is in some sense, eternally constrained by something outside himself. By the word outside, I don't mean like literally outside, like, God's a self-enclosed like container, and that there's something outside of that, but by something that's independent of God, extrinsic to God, that the information doesn't come from God. It comes, as it were, to God from without. Okay? And I say that's at odds with the doctrine of aseity. It may be helpful for me to add just a word about, what is aseity?
That'd be good.
It comes from the Latin word phrase ase, which means from or by itself. So on the standard view of God in all of the monotheistic religions is that God is the sole ultimate source and foundation of all of reality. That everything starts with God and God alone, right? And then God creates everything else. And so there's nothing below God, as it were, more fundamental than God, that God is dependent on, right? And there's nothing out here, outside, extrinsic to God, that God's got to reckon with, right? In the beginning, God, right? God created, right? The heavens and the earth. That God creates everything else that is not God. So the idea is that, again, in the beginning, there's God and God alone, and hence God is se. There is, is independent of anything extrinsic. And Molinism, I say, posits this realm of information, contingent information, that is extrinsic to God and that is not grounded in God and is not dependent on God in any way. It's independent. And so that's something extrinsic to God that God's got to reckon with.
So I have a question though. How
Yeah.
how would you handle kind of a to quote away from the Molinist friend toward us open theists then,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of open theism essentially gathering information from outside of himself? How would you answer this?
Well, I would say that on the open theist account, uh, God deliberately creates a world and enters into like two-way relations with that world. So God
I see what you're saying.
God is open to receiving input from that world, like as we make our choices, as we pray our prayers and stuff. God is listening, God is responding.
So I
So
guess if I'm following you, what you're saying is that prior the creation or when God was all by himself, I guess if he depends on something outside of himself, then he's no longer I say, even if later on he decides to let himself be informed by the external world, that's a different story. Would I
yeah, I would say it's a different story, because on the open theistic model, the reality of things other than God that can affect God is something that is wholly up to God. It's God's own decision to bring such things into being. It's not something that is this kind of eternal constraint on God that God has no say about.
I see. Because at the point of creation he does have say on he does have a say of how he wants the creation to operate and his relationship with creation.
Yeah, yes. Open theists will often say that, if God had wanted to, not that not that he would have, but that if God had wanted to, he could have created this completely deterministic world of, just a bunch of dominoes just, strung together in an infinite sequence, and he just watches, them fall one after another. I mean, okay. I mean, yeah, God could have done that. It's a stupid sort of world, I think. But I mean, if God deems it otherwise, I mean, who am I to naysay that? But we think God didn't do that because God wanted a world with free creatures, and so. But the idea is that because the existence of those creatures is something that is itself dependent on God, they don't work against God's aseity, because God is not, as it were, eternally and uh, uh, constrained by this. It's a purely contingent constraint that God willed into being.
Interesting. Excellent. So, and about sovereignty, so it's essentially now we spoke of the assay aspect, the aseity aspect, and how do you see this in, perhaps you can develop more the aspect of sovereignty with
Yeah. Well,
this.
in the I think the root sense of the word sovereignty, I mean, it's something we get from our notion of kingship, right? Of monarchy. Uh, is just that you have a ruler who is effectively in charge of some domain. So usually in discussions of models of providence, we want to say God is sovereign, that is especially over creation, right? So you have God and creation. So if it's not on the God side, it's going to be on the creation side. And so God is sovereign over creation. And that means God is the ultimate and effective ruler of creation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people, like Calvinists, like to pack into that notion of sovereignty a sort of universal determinism that, well, for God to be sovereign, God's got to be controlling and meticulously controlling everything that happens in creation. I don't think that follows from the core notion of sovereignty. I think God could sovereignly decide to create beings that are genuinely free. A way to think about this is if you're the CEO of a company, right? You're sovereign over your company, right? You get to make the decisions as to who gets hired and fired and how we're going to invest our resources and stuff like that. You've got two ways you can decide to run your company. One, you can decide to run it as a micromanager. You can say, I'm going to call all the shots. All of my subordinates have to report to me for every decision. They can't even decide what sort of paper to order for our copier unless they consult me. I have to sign off on everything. Okay. That's the kind of sovereignty that you get in a Calvinist system, right? Or actually also in a Molinist system, right? Because
Same thing.
the Molinists are committed to what we call meticulous providence. That is, God's creative decree specifies everything. So God
outside
is
outside the terminology used, Molinism, whether they call it predestination or whether they call it whatever, it's still the same as meticulous providence,
yeah,
which is the same thing.
yeah, yeah. It's what Calvinism and Molinism have in common, right? Both affirm a meticulous providence, right? God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. The alternative way you could run your company as a CEO is to be a delegator. And this is generally, at least for most of our companies that we that people actually run, is considered the wiser strategy, especially for those of for human beings who are finite in their ability to make all these decisions. We have to split that up into a bunch of decision makers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you at the CEO, you said, okay, I'm going to appoint people under me who will then have the ability to point other people, and they will have some ability to make decisions on their own level. And then people below them will have some ability to make decisions at their level, and so on down. And so the person at the top doesn't have to decide everything. What they have decided is to not decide everything, but to leave some of the details uh, up to the subordinates to decide.
It's
And
interesting.
both are models of sovereignty.
Yeah, I would just a passing thought. Don't lose your thought. I was thinking of man being in the image, made in the image of God, and sometimes this is seen as man being like a somebody who cooperates with God in the management of creation. But it
Mm-hmm.
seems to me that in the same sense that you misdefine what sovereignty is on Molinism and Calvinism, it seems to me that it encroaches on the imager, man being an image of God because he doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Speaking
it
of
makes sense.
speaking of that idea, man is created in the image of God. In the second chapter of Genesis, this is right after creation. we're told God brings the animals to Adam and to see what he would call them. In other words, he delegated to Adam the job of naming the creatures.
Exactly.
That,
It
to
wasn't.
my mind, is a fairly clear, a biblical example that God has chosen, at least to some degree, to operate as a delegator and not as a all-encompassing micromanager.
Exactly. So
Um,
I'm sorry. Continue what you were saying. Just the image came forth. My mind was so vivid. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, how about we turn from my charge against Molinism here to see how Tim Stratton replies. Is that okay
Okay.
with you?
Yeah. That'd be great.
Let me
Definitely.
see. If I switch this tab, will it switch it for you?
I think I'll need to. You must close this one,
Oh,
and
okay.
I'll.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have to go back here. Actually, I can. All right, 7. Here we go. All right. So here's his response. He says, according to Rhoda, Molinism denies divine aseity because God is allegedly constrained by truths external to him. I think so far he's stated it well, but then he says this is a category error. He doesn't really explain what he means by that or how it winds up being a category error, but let's go on. Maybe it'll become clear. He says God's omniscience means he knows all truths. I agree with that, including contingent ones. Necessarily. The truths themselves are not outside of God in a way that compromises his aseity. Rather, they are known by God necessarily, even they are not necessary in themselves. I think he's missing the point here. Yes, God's omniscience means he knows all truths, including contingent ones, of course. When he uses the word necessarily here, he's being a bit ambiguous. There's the phrase, like you could read this as saying that necessarily God, being omniscient, knows all truths.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But if you say God, being omniscient, necessarily knows these truths, i.e., these contingent truths, then you're talking nonsense, right? It's necessary that God knows all truths. Granted, that follows from omniscience, but it's not necessary that God knows these truths, these contingent truths. That's not necessary.
Well, certainly not these contingent truths as not being contingent in his sight.
Yeah. So it's confusing what's called de re and de dicto necessity. It's necessary de dicto, as they say, or it's necessary that if God is omniscient, then God knows all truths, including contingent ones. But it's not the case that if God is omniscient, then God necessarily knows contingent truths, right? Because you can't know contingent truths necessarily. You can because in different possible worlds, God's going to know different contingent truths, which means. So anyway, he says these truths are not outside of God. Well, okay. I mean, the point is not so much that they're outside in the sense that they exist independently of God, but their status as truths is something that seems to be independent of God.
It seems there's a confusion here because a truth, when you know something, you know it inside, but it's not about you. It's about something outside of you.
Mm-hmm.
There's an aboutness of truth, of knowing truth that cannot be just unless you're knowing truth about yourself. Even then, it's still about something So
Hmm.
there's an aboutness that isn't being missed here, I think. I don't know if I'm being clear.
I'm not sure exactly how that applies here. Perhaps you can.
But because what I mean is that if God knows something about all these contingent truths, this is an internal state of God knowing this, but these truths refer to something outside of God. They refer to a reality that is not in God. It refers to something outside of God, even if it's in a future.
Um, I'm still not quite following.
That's fine.
I, I get the idea that truths are about something. They have
But
a, yeah.
yeah, because the thing is, it seems to me that if God is omniscient, it doesn't follow that because He knows all truth that all these truths must be im, uh, inside of God. Meaning, like you were saying,
Hmm.
these truths are about something outside of God, or else there would be no difference between the reality outside and God, and so we would be back to a kind of monism where God is everything and everything is God. If there's
Okay.
anything, if there's anything different outside of God, so if there's no monism, then everything God knows about creation is by definition about something else than God Himself. Is this
Yeah,
clearer?
I I think so. I mean,
You
so,
know?
uh, so it's clear that Tim doesn't like my use of this word outside,
Yes, clearly.
or extrinsic was another word I used. Okay, so let's say that these truths are in some sense inside God. Uh, Still, they're independent of God's nature. That's something all Molinists agree. And they're independent of God's will. So, what are they? I mean, what about God are these truths describing? Say, suppose it's true by virtue of middle knowledge that if placed in a certain type of garden with a certain type of serpent, that Adam and Eve would freely uh, rebel against God. Um, th- uh, what is that? I mean, truth about, to use your term. I mean, it, it's what reality is it referring to or describing? It can't be describing, again, God's nature or God's will. Are we just
Exactly.
saying God is intrinsically such that if Adam and Eve were placed in these circumstances, then they would freely rebel? Uh,
That's exactly what I was pointing to. Yeah.
uh, but this information is, but then you're saying that there's all these uh, like metaphysically and logically like contingent information that's so somehow attached to God's being that God has never did and never could have had any say about. It's just like, oh, God just finds himself with all these properties stuck into him. It's like, huh, like the way I might wake up one morning and discover, oh, I've got a new like age spot in my arm or something. I've got all these freckles. What am I going to do with them? Well, they're just there. Uh, uh, I mean, okay. So God's got all these middle knowledge freckles. Um, they're not extrinsic to God in some sense, but they are extrinsic to God in the sense that that God never did and never could have had any say about them.
Mm.
Uh, they're independent of God in that way, and because of that, they can and the Molinists themselves insist on this, that middle knowledge information constrains what God can do.
Yes.
right?
Definitely. Very clear.
It restricts the scope of God's creative possibilities from all logically possible worlds to the much smaller sphere of all feasible worlds.
Which is why they call
So
it feasible, because even God cannot make these other non-feasible worlds.
yeah, so I don't know how you can really avoid the conclusion that God's sovereignty over uh, over is limited by middle knowledge in comparison with, say, how it is for an open theist or a Calvinist. On neither of those other two views are God's prior options, are God's creative options constrained by middle knowledge information, because those two models don't think there is any middle knowledge information. There's just the scope of what is, of the logically possible worlds. We might suppose that there are other constraints besides mere logical possibility, like it's got to cohere with God's nature as a perfectly good being and stuff. But that's going to apply to all the models, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's not one model that needs. Yeah.
So the relevant distinction there is again, between the fact that middle knowledge limits God's the scope of God's creative freedom in a way that the other models do not, and in that sense, it restricts God's sovereignty, and also because it limits God, as it were. As Tim says, these are not things that exist apart from God, limiting. Well, they may not exist apart from God, but they do limit Him nonetheless.
Or else you wouldn't need this construct of feasible world.
Yeah. And so, and then he wants to say that Molinism preserves sovereignty, preserves it better than open theism, because it affirms that God predestines all things while still preserving human agency, freedom, and responsibility. I think he's wrong there, and this sort of touches on what we've already talked about the meaning of sovereignty and stuff.
Even the meaning of freedom here, of because I was listening to this other to the response they made to Warren McGrew's episode, and they really do not like the idea of alternate possibility in terms of libertarian free will. They want to stick with only sourcehood, and it seems to me that the way they articulate sourcehood, it is problematic in terms of libertarian free will, because if you take this idea of essences, if God knows the essences, and that these essences have all these possibility of what they will do in each situation, then these essences, well, they precede the actual being, and this essence necessitates what the individual will do. And so you've got sourcehood there, but you have no alternate possibility. How do you have free will if your essence dictates your behavior? That makes no sense to me.
I would argue that for a libertarian conception of human freedom, that you can't have sourcehood without alternative possibilities. The two go hand in hand.
I agree.
Because the libertarian conception of freedom is explicitly anti-deterministic. Right? It is incompatible with determinism. That's part of the definition of a libertarian free will. Incompatibility with determinism means we have to say it's compatible with indeterminism. If you think it's incompatible with both, then you're not a libertarian. You're what's called a hard determinist, or actually a hard incompatibilist, which says that we don't have free will because free will is just impossible.
Yes.
It's not compatible
Either
with,
pure randomness or pure
yeah.
determinist.
But the libertarian says, no, no, free will is incompatible with determinism, but it is compatible and at some level entails indeterminism. And indeterminism, though, implies alternative possibilities. There's got to be multiple ways things could go from this point. So I don't really think it's coherent to be a pure sourcehood libertarian without any alternative possibilities.
But as soon as you factor in alternate possibilities, I guess you lose libertarian free will automatically on Molinism by default almost, which is why they don't want that. They just want sourcehood.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, I can see why one might want to say that. I just think that you give up libertarian notion of freedom there in the process.
And I think your conclusion, what you wrote, that post you made on Facebook about compatibilism, I think, which is why I think, like you, that Molinism just becomes pure compatibilism, and it is conditional ability and never categorical ability.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So for the sake of the listeners, the other day, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I just wrote a short little thing on Facebook where I was talking about how for Molinism, because the only room for contingency in the system is with respect to which possible world is actual, and that's a decision God makes and not one we make. There's really no actual contingency left for creatures. Now, the way that in the free will debate that you have a position known as classical compatibilism. This is distinguished from a different view that's known as semi-compatibilism, but we won't go into that. What the classical compatibilist wants to say is that free will is compatible with causal determinism. So you can be fully determined to do exactly what you do, but what the compatibilist will say, but you could have done otherwise, because if you had wanted to do otherwise, then you would have done otherwise. So they cash out the alternative possibilities in a conditional way, right? If you had wanted otherwise, that's ignore the fact that given the deterministic causal system that we're supposing, you actually could not have wanted otherwise. They want to, move from this actual world where everything is determined to this off to the side here, to this alternative modal space, and say, yeah, but in this space you're doing otherwise.
And this is the same strategy that Molinists will use.
Yeah, because what they have to do is they have to shift it from the actual world to a different possible world and say, oh no, you could have done otherwise than what God knew by his middle knowledge that you would do, because if this other world were actual, then middle knowledge there might have been different, and it might have been such that if you had been placed in that same circumstance as you were in the actual world, that you would have acted differently.
But it's an entirely other modal space, like you said, which I think I loved it.
Right, you can't just stick here in the actual reality and say, at the point of choice, I really can do this and I can do this. I can go left and I can also go right, and it's up to me at that point which way I go. On the Molinist account, if you're making a free choice there, which way you go has already been baked into reality by the middle knowledge. It's eternally been true that if you were placed at that choice thing, that you would make, choose the left path or as opposed to the right one. It's so the only way to get the alternatives again is you have to step outside of the actual situation and shift the context to a different modal, to a different possible world, and so they give a conditional analysis of alternative possibilities, whereas intuitively the libertarian freedom wants to say that to affirm a categorical type of alternative possibilities, that at the moment of free choice you really can do both of two incompatible things. You can't do them both at once, right? But you it's within your power to to do A, and within your power to do not A. So at that point, it's an open question.
Exactly.
What's going to happen, and you are the one who makes that call. If God is sovereignly predestining all things, as Tim says, then it's not your call at that point. God's already specified.
And it's not obvious to me at all. It's not obvious to me at all why. Because let's say open theist, I think every model, those honest people from other models or from other beliefs will look at open theists and say, well, yes, they believe in libertarian free will, and they can see how we can believe in sovereignty because of how we articulate things. But it's far from obvious to me how, like when I look at Molinism, because I don't accept all these very loaded ontology or metaphysics that they want to front load in all this explanatory construct they make. It's far from obvious why we should accept what he said here. It's as if, well, this is what Molinism says, yes, but that's not. We have to accept all these other elements of Molinism to agree with you. That's what it says, or what does it mean?
Yeah, it does affirm that God predestines all things, and it says that it does this while preserving human agency, freedom, and responsibility. But I've argued above, in point number 2 of my criticism, that it actually doesn't. I mean, you can say whatever you want. The question is your position actually coherent? And I don't think Molinism is.
It's not.
Maybe we should move on to the next point, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Problem of evil. So let me shift over to that. Give me a sec here. Okay. Now this is very briefly stated, but okay. So the Molinism, as Tim just noted, right? It affirms this exhaustive notion of, God predestines all things, or God specifically ordains all things, whatsoever comes to pass. So I say, well, Molinism entails that God specifically ordains every evil thing that ever happens. And here I want to focus primarily on moral evil, okay? Sin, to use a different word. Every sin that ever happens, it was included in God's selection of the feasible world. Again, these worlds, as the Molinist conceives of them, include a complete determinate history. So everything that happens in that world is something that when God says, I want this world, God is selecting all of those things as the complete package. Okay. Now, it's fair to say that God presumably doesn't want these evils for their own sake, right? Because what God's selecting is the whole package, right? The whole feasible world. And maybe, in terms of what options God has available, because he's limited by his middle knowledge, there's certain like trade-offs that have to be made, right? So maybe God selects a feasible world that's got like the Holocaust and a bunch of other, things which we can agree are really, really bad in them. But in terms of the other options God had, that was the best overall pick, because all the other sort of feasible worlds included evils that were at least as bad. But anyway, so God may not want each particular evil for its own sake, but he does presumably want them for the sake of some sort of greater good that he allegedly couldn't have obtained without either those specific evils or something comparably bad. This, I say, is massively implausible on its face. One, because there is a lot of what we call seemingly gratuitous evil in the world. Is gratuitous evil? It's, so the way this is standardly defined in the literature, an evil would qualify as gratuitous if it is not specifically necessary to obtain a greater good or to prevent a worse evil, or we could perhaps even add a worse or equivalent evil, right? It's something that God could have gotten whatever goods God is aiming at in creation without that evil in question, which, if that is the case, then it raises the question, well, why the heck did God ordain that evil? God didn't get anything from it that God couldn't have gotten without it. So it's gratuitous. It's just like it's a pointless evil. So now, of course, what may seem gratuitous to us may not be actually gratuitous, because we're limited in what information we have, right? God's got information we don't. And so this is why I talk about seemingly gratuitous evil. Okay. There's lots of evils out there that when we think about them, as far as we can tell, it sure looks like that's just a pointless evil.
It does, really.
If God was micromanaging all of history, that God could have gotten whatever goods God is aiming at in creation without that, or at least without anything that bad. Perhaps he would have had to tolerate some kind of evil, but he could have mitigated it significantly. Either had fewer evils or fewer severe evils, or what have you. So one, there seems to be a lot of gratuitous evil. Two, the Molinist God, again, this is God as a micromanager, unlike the open theist God, who is a delegator. He does not merely permit any of these evils, right? God as the micromanager is making every decision, and in choosing a specific feasible world, God is effectively making that decision. He's saying, I want this whole package, right? Like if you go to a restaurant, right, and you're looking at your at the menu, right, and you have a list of options there, and say, okay, I can order a hamburger, I can order a soup, I can get a salad, and you're considering what you want. When you make your choice, assuming it comes to you as described, you don't really have a basis for complaint. Like, oh man, I didn't really want this meal. Oh no, you ordered it, right? If and God being a perfectly omniscient and everything, I mean, if God selects a world, he knows full well what he's getting there. And he is absolutely certain that if I select this world, I'm going to get this, right? Now, the middle knowledge does add a constraint onto what God can do. So instead of having this huge menu, God has maybe a slightly smaller menu, right? It's reduced from all the possible worlds to a group of feasible worlds. But still, within those feasible worlds, God knows exactly what he's going to get if he picks any one of those. And then God chooses one of them. So in choosing that world, God's saying, okay, I select this whole world, and that means God's implicitly selecting everything in it, not necessarily for its own sake, okay, but again, for the sake of the whole, of the greater good. So in that sense, he's specifically ordaining everything that ever happens, including every moral evil. So the third point is, I want to say, even with the middle knowledge constraint, right, the way in which it limits God's menu of options, right, from a really big menu to a somewhat smaller menu, it's almost certain that God could have achieved whatever greater goods he's aiming at without nearly as much or nearly as bad seemingly gratuitous evil. So why do I say this? Well, the scope, okay, let's start with the Calvinist view, okay, and then we'll work to Molinism. On the Calvinist view, God's not limited by middle knowledge, so God's menu of options is the entire menu, right? It's not filtered down, and so if we stipulate that God is perfectly good, as Calvinists will want to say, then what sort of world would you expect a God to pick, right, from the menu? I think you would expect that God would pick a world that has no gratuitous evil at all, right? One in which the only evils that obtain are ones that are really strictly necessary, either for a greater good or to prevent some worse evil. So you would expect, in light of that when God's looking at the whole scope of possible worlds, that he's going to kind of rank them, and the worlds at the bottom of the list are going to be those that have gratuitous evil in it, that they have an overabundance of evil that doesn't get God anything sufficiently good for the cost of those evils, right? So those worlds are going to be excluded, right, simply by God's goodness, right? God's going to aim for the worlds at the top of the ranking, ones where there's the balance of good over evil is really positive, right? So you would expect that God would pick either, something like the best of all possible worlds. This is in fact what Leibniz, who is a theistic determinist, believed. He thought it was just rationally necessary. God's going to consider all possible worlds and he's going to pick the best one. Now maybe that's too quick. Perhaps there is no such thing as the best possible world. Perhaps that's not even a well-defined concept. Still, or perhaps there are multiple worlds that wind up being sort of equally best, right? Just in different ways. Well, then we would expect God to pick one of the best. Or again, if the notion of a best, world is not a well-defined notion, then at the very least, we would expect there to be God to pick, say, a pretty darn good world, right? One where the balance of good over evil is heavily and obviously skewed in the direction of good over evil, and there is absolutely no gratuitous evil. Well, the problem is with the Calvinist view is that it really doesn't look like our world is that sort of world. We look around us and we say, "Wow, there's all these evils that really look gratuitous." And on the standard like Calvinist scheme, where they say, God, chooses to save only a certain portion of people, and there's a vast number of reprobates. You say, well, why did God have to reprobate so many? What greater good did that require? Or for what greater good was that required? And they'll say something like, well, God had to display his wrath. Well, okay, suppose we grant that. Why couldn't God have just displayed his wrath against like Satan and his minions? Why did he have to damn any humans to display his wrath? Or one good example would have been enough, I would think.
I think so.
So that kind of response doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. It sure seems like God could have gotten whatever goods God's aiming at with a lot less evil than we actually see on the Calvinist system. And so Calvinism, I think, looks really implausible in the face of evil. I think the same thing works for Molinism. Molinism, you have a smaller menu of options, and so there's a sense in which God gets a little more leeway because he can sort of blame the counterfactuals. He can say, gosh darn it, if it weren't for this middle knowledge that constrains what I can do, I could have picked this best of all possible worlds. But unfortunately, that one's off the table because it's inconsistent with my middle knowledge. Drat, that sucks. And God might feel a degree of chagrin over that. It's like, but he's going to look at his menu of options that are left after factoring middle knowledge, and he's going to rank them, and he's going to want to pick something that's near the top of the ranking, right? If not the top, if there is such a clear top one. So you would expect God would pick either the best of all feasible worlds, or if there are many such, then one of the best, or if the notion of a best is not well defined, then he's going to pick something like, a pretty darn good feasible world where there's, the balance of good over evil is heavily favored, leans heavily in favor of the good, and there's no gratuitous evil. And again, it sure seems like there's a lot of seemingly gratuitous evil out there that God could have done without. He could have gotten whatever goods he's aiming at without those bad things. So why did God pick a feasible world that included those things? I don't see that middle knowledge really materially changes the problem. The only real, thing that I think both Calvinists and Molinists can say at this point is will typically appeal to what's called skeptical theism, which they'll say, well, yeah, all these evils really look gratuitous, but because we're creatures and we don't have God's cosmic perspective on things, we're really in no position at all we can't be at all confident that these things that seem gratuitous to us really are gratuitous. And so we ought to discount that. To that, I say there's, let me see, how do I want to put this? I think their appeal to skeptical theism, it's partly right, partly wrong. It's certainly right that due to the limited scope of our information, that we can't be wholly confident that just because something seems gratuitously evil to us, that therefore it is gratuitously evil. But unless we're prepared to countenance a pretty widespread moral skepticism, we should not take this to say that no matter what evil we might point to, we can be no more confident that it is a gratuitous evil than that it is not. I think if you're going to say that, then you're saying that our moral ability to discriminate good and evil completely breaks down. We have no way of discriminating between what's truly good and what's truly evil. And if you're going to say that,
we're back in almost moral relativism.
Then you've just got moral skepticism at that point. That's not a good thing. So that's would be the gist of my critique of Molinism on respect to the problem of evil. I don't think it really does much at all towards actually solving the problem, and because of that, it has to rely on a much too strong form of skeptical theism to try to rebut the problem. So
what does Tim answer to this fifth point?
Well, let's see. Let me switch over to that tab. Okay, he says, probably the Molinism handles it best, and it's not even close. That's kind of interesting. Okay, he says, Rhoda argues that Molinism entails that God ordains every evil thing, making it implausible. Molinism doesn't teach that God wills evils for its own sake. I made that point myself, right? Yeah. Okay, only that he permits it as part of a world where greater goods, including human libertarian freedom, rational responsibility, and moral accountability possible. Okay, I mean, I grant all that, but that doesn't really get to the issue, right? The issue is, I mean, yeah, the Molinism supposedly makes these other goods possible, but if you've got middle knowledge, and like say, why did Adam and Eve sin in the garden? Well, because God knew by his middle knowledge that if he placed them in that circumstance, then they would freely sin. Okay, but then why did God put them in the garden?
Yeah.
If God didn't want them to sin, he could have changed the circumstances slightly, such that now the middle knowledge conditional falls out that they would freely resist Satan and remain obedient to God.
And furthermore, libertarian free will would have been still available, since options would have been available, freedom of, altered possibilities, sourcehood, everything would have been there.
Yeah.
Or why put a fruit there?
Yeah. So God can play around with the scenario, it seems. Okay. But suppose you say though, but Adam and Eve have this thing that Plania called trans-world depravity. They're such that, like, in no matter what sort of initial choice scenario God had tested them in, they would have failed the test. All right. Well, that seems really implausible. That seems incredibly implausible to me. But suppose that's true for Adam and Eve. Okay, well then God can just replace them with other possible individuals, because God's all of his middle knowledge concerns these hypothetical individuals. How many hypothetical individuals are there?
Yeah.
If I had to hazard a guess, I would say there's an uncountably infinite number of them.
Potentially, definitely.
And so if Adam and Eve won't give God the results that he wants, then he can just choose, say, Steve and Mary, right? And instantiate their creaturely essences, and such that, and they are such that they, would resist the devil's temptation in the garden.
What I find
But
what I
right,
was, excuse me, yeah, what I find very implausible. I was thinking what you were saying about planting as a transworld depravity thing. It actually pushes the goalpost even nearer. And now it's not because of the fall we are depraved, it's because we are created. Because if this is true of all humans, this transworld depravity, then there's no way God could have created creatures that didn't sin.
yeah, yeah.
Talk about limiting
It's
God's sovereignty.
yeah, it's a notion that is incredibly implausible on its face, right? And the Plantinga and William Lane Craig as well take seriously the possibility that this might be true of every possible
So this would
creaturely
be
individual,
necessary.
which would just be incredible, especially because middle knowledge information is, by definition, it is contingent. So that it should turn out that every possible free creature that God could have brought into being would have chosen to sin at the earliest possible opportunity is so massively implausible that it's just like, if you're going to hang your hat on that, I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, when the idea was brought up by Plantinga, he was raising it in the context of a defense against
Yeah.
the logical problem of evil, and in that context, I mean, all he's trying to do is show that it's theoretically possible that God could have maybe not been able to create a world in which there was no sin. And so he invokes this idea of transworld depravity as just a hypothetical possibility without any concern for its plausibility. But once we shift away from just trying to defend against a logical problem of evil, which says that the mere existence of evil is incompatible with Christian theism, to the evidential problem, which is where the plausibility of these moves becomes relevant, now appeals to transworld depravity just looks stupid. I mean, really,
It does. It does. Yeah.
it's that's not the way you want to go. So
And because it speaks more about, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that it speaks more about the kind of creator God is than what we are. Because if he's not able to create something other than a transworld depraved creature, that says a lot about him more than it
yeah,
says about the world he created.
yeah. If you want to, argue that that doesn't impinge on God's sovereignty, I don't know.
I don't know what it is. Yeah,
No,
exactly.
no, what wouldn't? So the charge against the Molinist here is that, I mean, yeah, God wants a world in which we have these goods like human libertarian freedom and moral accountability, but that does nothing to address this problem of seemingly gratuitous evil. It sure seems like God could have gotten a feasible world where all those goods are included, and you have no moral evil at all, or at least far, far less moral evil. So Molinism doesn't really even address that. So I don't think Tim actually engages with my critique at all in
I don't
any
think he does.
clear way. Then
He does
he
speak
wants,
in elsewhere. He did speak of something about God choosing the best end game, where he chose the world for the best end game, and he did say that in his mind there was only one such world that could count as the best end game. Although he did refer to Craig and others that did not believe that this was just one possible world, and so but he in his mind he says, well, it's the best end game, not just the
Yeah,
best world.
that's again. I mean, you can say that, and that might be logically possible in the same way that, say, tossing a fair coin an infinite number of times and having it land heads every single time is possible, but, by stipulation of the scenario. It's certainly not plausible.
No.
And what you wanted response to the problem of evil is something that's at least in the ballpark of plausibility.
Yeah.
What the open theist can say that Molinists and Calvinists can't say is that, specifically with respect to moral evil, that God did not decree any of it. What God wanted, because he wanted creatures with real moral freedom, he wanted a world in which sin is possible, but he never wanted a world in which sin was actual.
Mm-hmm.
And so the open theist can consistently, and I think very plausibly, say that sin, whenever it occurs, is always tragic. It's always something less than and other than God desired. It didn't have to happen. It wasn't necessary for the best possible world, or even the
It
best
certainly was
never
never
possible
ordained.
world. Yeah. It's only the possibility of sin that was necessary, and it was necessary precisely so that creatures could have moral freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So what God willed on the open theist world, he didn't select the best possible world, or the best feasible world, or even the best, because what God on the open theist model is not selecting entire worlds with a complete history. God's choosing a set of initial conditions, right? And the kind of the laws of nature, and how God's going to interact with his creation as it develops. So that's what God decides. He decides a certain, so we're world type,
Exactly.
right? But not a complete world. And in this world type, sin is not at all required. It's something that enters into the system, but that's a tragedy. And God is now working in the best way he can, within the framework of the kind of world God wanted, where there is robust creaturely freedom, to redeem his creation from that sin, to restore it to how it ought to have been all along. And that, I think, is not on the face of it, implausible thing to say.
I think
Unlike,
it's more plausible than the Molinist construct.
yeah. But anyway, he wants to try to turn the objection around against open theism. He says, oh, in this view, God may have been caught off guard by Hitler and the Nazis, perhaps the horrors of the Holocaust. Oh, okay. I mean, one, say, no, that's absolutely not possible on open theism, because for the open theist, just as for the Molinist, right, God's natural knowledge includes knowledge of all possibilities. God's going to know from the get-go that if I create a world with this internal structure, these laws of nature, these initial conditions, and I intervene here and there, God knows everything that's possible from that point on, right? He certainly knew from the get-go that the rise of Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust and all that stuff was a possibility.
So one thing I want to say though right here is, I know Tim really finds it important that we always steel man the other person's position, but I find this less than obvious that this is a steel man of the open theist position when he says this about the Holocaust.
Yeah, I
I
agree.
think that is more of a straw man than a steel manning of our position.
Yeah, I agree. So God was not caught off guard by this or by any evil that ever occurs. God always knew these things were possible. Uh, God, but the open theist can say that God merely permitted this
Yes.
for
Never
some
ordained any of
greater
this.
good. He did not specifically ordain it. He did not choose a world knowing full well that this was definitely going to happen,
Hmm.
which he did on the Molinist account. Um, so I'm not sure why he thinks that this counts against open theism and in favor of Molinism here. Uh, uh, okay, once God did realize what was happening and fully grasp what the Nazis were doing, he says, "What kind of being worthy of worship would permit such atrocities to continue?" Well, I could turn that around on the Molinist. What sort of being worthy of worship would specifically ordain these kinds of atrocities?
All of the
Uh,
individual atrocities.
I mean, if I've got a hard time answering his question, well, he's got to have an equally hard, if not worse, time answering my question. It's not better for him. He's in a weaker position to deal with this than the open theist is, because the open theist can say, yes, these things truly are horrible. Yes, God did not want them. God did not ordain them. But God's got ways of bringing good out of evils that we cannot fathom. Uh, uh, but God grieves over this. He's angered over it. But God's not done with creation, and even if we don't see in the short term how God works this toward good, in the long term, that's the end game. God's going to redeem everything that remains redeemable in creation.
One thing maybe you can help me understand. I'm trying to figure this out. I've been trying to figure this out for a while on Molinism. Uh, let's say that, well, Tim believes that there's only one end game that is the best possible world, the best possible end game. So it seems to me that there was never any contingency as to which world God would choose, because there's, when he saw all the possibilities, there was only one option possible. So it seems to me that this decision from God was necessary. I don't know if you
Mm-hmm.
understand what I'm saying, because it seems to me that if God's decision was to aim at this the best end game possible,
Mm-hmm.
and there's only one, well, then there's no question about it. That's the one he would choose, and that's a necessary choice then.
I mean, yeah, that that sounds more like something that an open theist would say, that God's aiming at the best end game, because the open theist, since God isn't selecting entire worlds but only a certain world type, the open theist can say that, well, why did God set up the type of world he did? Because uh, while this isn't the best possible world, it's not even a complete world yet.
Yes,
It's a uh, it's God's aiming at the best type of end result.
right, right, right.
One and So God deemed that starting with this kind of world was the best way to get to that best type of end game. Uh, just like a chess player, in strategizing, like, I want to play a good game, I'm going to choose my opening so
Yes,
that it helps set me up for the best uh, possible, uh, for the middle game and end game. I don't have to decide every move. I don't have to choose how the whole game's going to go. I just got to have a game plan for how we're going to start this game and how we're going to deal with the various moves that my opponent may make along the way. Uh, so uh, so the idea that God's aiming for some kind of best end game seems to me something that an open theist can certainly say, well, I'm on board with that. But if you think that there's some very specific end game, that it's got to fall out exactly one way, that seems to me really implausible. I mean,
I
why would
think
we think that?
I think the idea is that Doctor Strange analogy from Endgame, from the movie, where Doctor Strange, he chose the first decision so that ultimately it will arrive and where only one possibility where we win. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems to me that this is what he wanted to cash out with this idea of the best possible endgame. But
Yeah, I think we talked about that last time, the Doctor Strange analogy, and didn't think it was actually a very good analogy. It seems to presuppose creaturely determinism, because Strange is the only person who seems to have any freedom there. He's the one who gets to explore all these possibilities, but everything else is playing out exactly the same way every time. And so that's why Strange is able to sort of adjust one sort of variable at a time and say, well, how about I try this? If and then we'll see how it plays out. Now we use the time stone, roll it back. It's the same thing as the Groundhog Day movie, right? The only
yeah,
one who seems to
exactly.
have any freedom is the weatherman guy, because he gets to change his behavior every day. But everybody else does exactly the same thing at exactly the same schedule. They're not free. He is. So, but
Exactly.
anyway, shall we move on?
Yeah. I think we're we're
Uh,
getting great. We're I think we're going to make a trio of this.
okay.
I don't mind going on
I'm
though.
going to try to be much briefer these next
All
two.
right, excellent.
We could develop, especially the sixth one, at length, but that probably should be saved for another stream, just because
Well,
there's
you know
so
what? That
much
yeah,
material.
I enjoyed these streams so much that let's make it a third one. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. But that, so
Let
the
me just
sixth
yeah.
argument had to do with just biblical implausibility. Because Molinism affirms that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. That's a well-known slogan from the Westminster Confession. The Molinists don't necessarily have to endorse the Westminster Confession, but it's just a handy slogan that at least that part of the Westminster Confession Molinists are going to agree with, or should agree with, because it's part of their system. But I argue that because it affirms meticulous providence, Molinism can't make good sense of a whole lot of Bible passages, specifically ones that describe God as angry or sad about creaturely events. Why not? Well, because God ordained it that way, right? So what's he mad about? God's getting exactly what he ordered. You
Yeah.
know, he
He,
looked
that's what he
at
ordered for supper, and that's what he got.
yeah, he looked at the menu options and said, okay, I want this feasible world. It seems to give me the best overall
Return on
good,
investment.
yeah, yeah, return on investment. And knowing full well everything that's included in that. And so when bad things happen, that's part of the package. I mean, why would you get mad about it? Like, I knew that all along. Um,
You have to
or
spend money to make money. We have
I mean,
some losses.
as I said earlier, I can understand how God on Molinism might feel a certain level of chagrin, like, like sigh, I wish it didn't have to play out that way.
Yeah.
But gosh darn it, the middle knowledge, it constrained my options. I couldn't actualize a better world than this, and so I've just got to deal with this. I just got to suck it up and face this rebellion by my creatures that I wouldn't have chosen otherwise. But I did choose it, and now Okay. So you might feel some chagrin about this, but why the kind of intense anger or sadness that the Bible often depicts? Like in the early chapters of Genesis, chapter 6, it talks about how God got so mad at where humanity had gone that he wanted to just wipe it all out and start over, with Moses with Noah and his family as the initial seed for humanity, and then again he does the same thing. He's with the Israelites, and
Yeah.
he tells
He
Moses,
wants to start over. Yeah.
I'll start over with you, because I am really pissed at these people. They are, I just brought them out of Egypt, and now they're off worshiping a golden calf. What the heck, Um, um, so, why would God say things? I hate divorce, or God, I hate it when these people sacrifice their children to Molech. Well, no, you ordered that. That's
Yes.
part of what you ordained. Uh, um, Again, I just find it hard to stretch Molinism into those types of passages. Uh, Moreover, you have a lot of passages that present God as responsive to creation. Uh, God's interactions with Moses would be a case in point. Before he even sends Moses into Egypt, he's um, he meets him at the burning bush, and says, "Hey, here's what I want you to do." And Moses says, "Well, I don't, I, I have a stutter. I don't speak well. What if they don't believe me?" And so God gives them a bunch of conditionals. Well, if they don't respond to what you say, then give them this sign. And then he says, and if they don't respond to that, well, here's another thing. And just for good measure, I'll send your brother Aaron to meet you, and he can speak on your behalf. Okay, how about this? Does that address all your concerns? You know, uh, um, or think of the case of Abraham praying or with God over Sodom, right, where his nephew Lot was residing. There's this back and forth where Abraham says, "Well, if only like 30 people are okay there, will you destroy?" And God says, "Okay, for the sake of 30, for the sake of 20, and he gets them down to like 10 people, and right, you have this back and forth interaction, uh, uh, and you see this all throughout the Bible, right? All throughout the narrative passages.
Everywhere.
There's lots of two-way kind of dialogue between God and his creatures, and God is responding to them. You also have passages like Jeremiah 18, and there's a parallel passage in Ezekiel, but where it explicitly says that God's responses are conditional upon what creatures do. So if a nation that I have pronounced some judgment against, it says in Jeremiah 18, if they repent, then I will relent of the judgment that I had planned, and I won't bring the judgment upon them. But if a nation that I have pronounced some blessing on, if they then rebel against me, then I'm going to change my action, and I'm going to bring judgment upon them instead. And it's, God's saying explicitly, I am responsive. I'm going to adjust in response to how to what creatures do.
In real
So
time.
yeah, it's a two-way relationship here.
Yes.
For Molinism, though, it's really ultimately a strictly one-way relationship. God, from all eternity past, looked at all the feasible world options he had and selected one of them. And in selecting that, God selected everything in creation. God's all the details. There's nothing left for creatures to fill in the gaps here and say, okay, like God, you know, designs a house, but lets his creatures do the decorating inside however they want. No. God, in choosing the feasible world, has chosen everything. There's nothing left for us to do, right? So when God comes to Adam and says, I want you to name the animals, well, I mean, Adam's not really bringing anything new to the table at that point, because God knew from choosing the feasible world he did exactly what Adam was going to name them anyway. And so God had really indirectly chosen the names of all the animals by choosing Adam and placing him in the circumstances where it would be such that he would name them exactly what God wanted them to name them. So you don't get this real sense in Molinism of any two-way relationality.
Even the subjective conditionals in scripture don't seem to fit the Molinist conditionals. I mean, counterfactuals. It seems to me that, for instance, in 1 Samuel 23, when the Kayla, the folks, that whole
Let's look at
episode.
that actually.
All right,
sure. Because that's mentioned by Tim. So you can bring that up in direct response to him. So, okay, this is, he mentions it down here, right? Passages like 1 Samuel 23 and Matthew 11.
So God, in this whole episode with Kayla and David and this whole thing, God has real-time intelligence about what's going on in Saul's army, what's going on in the individuals in Kayla, the population in Kayla. He has all this real-time actual knowledge of what's going on everywhere. So it's not as if it was a decision from before creation that he set in motion, and it has nothing to do with this. This is real-time understanding of what's happening, and he's answering the question with the effort that David is asking. And it seems it is a stretch to put all this metaphysical junk, I'm sorry, stuff into this to understand this passage.
Yeah, both of these passages, both the one from Samuel and the one from Matthew. In the case of Matthew, it's the words of Christ, where he's saying that, like, if the nation of Sodom or Gomorrah or these other towns had witnessed, the kind of miracles that I'm doing here, they would have repented. Okay, and so it's good. So the judgment that's going to come is going to be more severe on you guys hearing me now, because your hearts are hard. But whereas Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented. Well, you don't need middle knowledge to know that. All you need to know is the actual heart condition of the people in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
In comparison with the heart condition of the people that Jesus is directly speaking to.
Exactly.
And you just know that these people's hearts are harder than those people's hearts.
It's a comparison. It's God's comparing his historical knowledge of the folks in those cities with his actual knowledge of what's going on in the heart of the folks living at the time of Jesus. I mean, it has nothing to do with Molinist counterfactuals. It's just God knowing, God being God and knowing what occurred in history and in real time now.
Yeah. So I don't think there are any passages in the Bible that actually clearly attest to middle knowledge. The two he lists are the two that Molinists like to cite, but they really, there's no indications that the information relayed here is information that God had pre-volitionally.
No.
That there was a determinate fact of the matter, even before anything was created, that if in this type of circumstance that David found himself in Kyla, that if Saul, were to exist and be in that situation alongside David, that he would go and hunt him out. And in fact, it's quite predictable from what else the text tells us about Saul. He's obsessed with the challenge of David to his kingship, and so that he would not go up to Kyla if David stays there, or that the men of Kyla would not hand him over. Well, I mean, that's not really surprising. I mean,
No.
if they know Saul's going to march on their city with an army, and they know Saul really wants to get this guy, I mean, are you going to stand up against Saul, or are you going to hand David over? I mean, I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet exactly what Scripture says.
So there's nothing curious about this. And the thing is, again, going back to last time, I mean, you've got to presuppose, and what we discussed at the beginning of this episode, you have to presuppose that Molinist counterfactuals are conceptually coherent, which is not a given.
Mm-hmm.
And you must hold that God is meticulously provident, and that He wants to meticulously control everything.
Mm-hmm.
Which is far from evident when you read Scripture. I mean, when you read Scripture, you don't come out of reading Scripture with the idea that God is meticulously provident. This is imposed on Scripture, not the other way around.
Yeah.
So unless you have to put all these presuppositions when you come to the text, I mean, Molinism doesn't even get off the ground.
Yeah, there's only a handful of verses that you could argue just based on a casual reading of the text that, this teaches meticulous providence. Like there's one in, I think, Ephesians chapter 1. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. Just to,
probably you're thinking of 1:11.
Yeah. Where it says, in Him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of Him who works out everything in conforming with the purpose of His will. And so Molinists and Calvinists will like to point to verses like this. And again, there are a small handful of verses that
some verses in Proverbs and
yeah,
but you have to go to wisdom literature to find verses, or this one, which is ambiguous at best, and considering that the text is about the benefits of salvation.
Working out everything in accordance with the purpose of His will doesn't entail meticulous providence unless you suppose that the purpose of God's will requires that God, be a micromanager.
Exactly.
What if God purposed to be a delegator with respect to creation? He micromanages maybe some things where it really matters to Him, but for the most part, He just allows us significant freedom to then I can say as an open theist, God works out everything in conformity with the purpose of His will, because that doesn't mean he's omnidetermining or meticulously provident. I mean, you're overreading the passage.
Mm-hmm.
You're reading too much into it, in other words.
Yes, you are. You're bringing in your theological grid to try and find a proof text.
So his response to my objection, he says, that Molinism affirms God knows how creatures will respond in all circumstances, interacts with them in real time. Well, in a sense, he does, but not in the relevant sense, I think. And he affirms that. He says God does not learn new relevant facts. Yeah, well, that's my point. That God's getting no information from creation. He's just sort of watching it play out exactly as He has foreordained.
Yes, he has decided that this would play out like that. It's like as if it's the metteur en scène, the one who directs, the director of the movie. It's as if he's surprised when the movie unfolds, what's happening, why the actor are saying that. I mean, well,
Yeah.
you're the director.
You know,
You've got the script.
and then it's kind of strange is there he can still respond in real time, just as Doctor Strange had emotional reactions to Tony Stark's death. I find this kind of appeal to fiction here uh, rather, I don't know, quaint. I'm not sure what the word is, but it's like, okay, just because somebody can write a fictional story where some character expresses emotion in some circumstance doesn't make it at all plausible that this is how things really would be for God in relation to creation. It's you can spin stories about time travel and all sorts of ridiculous possibilities. That doesn't mean that this is giving us a true take on things emotionally or otherwise. But uh, his responses in real time aren't going to be responses that are genuinely conditional, or let me say this way, that aren't like in Jeremiah 18, I think, where it's God's adjusting on the fly in response to what creatures do. No,
I think,
it's just God's playing his part in the already scripted play.
yeah, in this sense, I think it's even more problematic than simple foreknowledge, because at least in simple foreknowledge, God saw what he was going to do and how he was going to react, but he didn't was unable to adjust anything. He's just seeing in advance how things will turn out. So in a sense, this aspect is Molinism is worse off than simple foreknowledge in terms of the truthfulness of God's responses to human beings in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this makes sense, but it seems to me that it's worse off because that's the world he actually chose to actualize. This is what he
Yeah.
ordained, so you shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. All right. Shall we move on to the last point?
Yeah, yeah.
Again, we could say lots more about the biblical arguments pro and con, but again, that's really something of its a whole topic on its own.
Hmm.
So, all right, let's go. The last problem I raised for Molinism. This is one you don't typically hear in discussions of Molinism.
No, I was intrigued when I saw the heading, and I'm looking forward to hearing you cash this out.
Yeah. So this way of thinking about Christology and the relation of providence to Christology was something that uh, came to my attention a couple years back. I don't have the book with me here, but the name of the book is called The Hexagon of Heresy, and the author's name is Gifford, like the Jim Gifford, and he 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 spends the first half of the book looking at the six major Christological heresies and the kind of the development of what became Christological orthodoxy in response to those heresies. And what he argues is that all of these heresies were driven by um, a notion of absolute divine simplicity. A certain views about the nature of God that came into Christianity from Greek philosophy is what served as a spur for all of these Christological heresies. And he thinks, in fact, in light of, I mean, like once you accept that philosophical starting point, right? God is absolutely simple and stuff. he thinks that the Christological heresies were inevitable, that they had to come out because but I don't want to go too far afield into Gifford's book, but the way he develops his argument, he starts out by arguing that the six main heresies of Christology, that they're driven by this mistaken view about the nature of God. And then in the second half of the book, he shifts to cosmology, or the relation between God and creation generally. And he argues that you see the exact same six heresies that emerge, and it's driven by the exact same root cause, this faulty view of the nature of God that comes out of Greek philosophy. And so by drawing these parallels between Christology and cosmology, he helped me connect the dots between the two. And as I started thinking about it further, I thought, oh, this doesn't just apply to Christology and cosmology, but to divine providence and to soteriology and to ecclesiology. And I mean, every sphere where you have God relating to something that is not God is going to fall into the same kind of grouping of heresies, if you will. Again, I use the word heresy here with like scare quotes because these aren't positions that are like canonically defined as heresies, by like the Universal Church or something. But you see these parallels that turn up in all of these different spheres, and it's all the same root cause. It's because they're starting with this view of God that does not allow God and creation to synergize. They cannot actually work together in a fundamental way. And so it's got to get tilted on one side or the other. Either God's got to back off and creation has to gets to limit God. And this is what you have in like process theism, or more radically views like the deism and stuff, where God just a creation has its sphere and God has to stay out of it, right? He can't interfere. Or on the other hand, you have a view where because God and creation can't harmoniously sort of synergize, that God's got to dominate creation. He's got to make it do what he wants. And that's exactly what you get in like Calvinism, right? And in Molinism, I would say. In Molinism is committed to a cosmology because it affirms meticulous providence, where God is specifying everything that ever comes to pass in creation. So he's ultimately behind the scenes, he's calling all the shots, which means creation doesn't get to call any of the shots. So the parallel between these, okay, and the way this applies to Christology, if, as an Orthodox Christology affirms, Christ is fully divine and fully human, then by virtue of that, he's not only the mediator between God and man, as we read in 1 Timothy, but he's also the mediator between God and creation generally. That is, no creature can have a closer relation to God than Christ's human nature does to his divine nature. Okay? So in addition, it's going to follow from this that any providential limits, like the limits that our doctrine of divine providence places on how God interacts with creation, are going to have to be mirrored in the incarnation. Why? Because Christ's human nature is part of that creation, right? So if on like Calvinism, right, it affirms theistic determinism, right? God is the ultimate sufficient cause of everything that ever happens in creation. Then the relation of Christ's human nature to his divine nature has got to be a one-way causal relation. Otherwise, your Christology is inconsistent with the model of providence, right? You're being inconsistent, right? Christ becomes this lone exception to the rule that applies to all the rest of creation. In which case, then he's not really our mediator, right? He's not one who.
It's not both ways. It's not a two-way street. It's just a one-way street.
Yeah, if you break the parallel with Christ, then you can't say, as Hebrews does, that Christ is able to sympathize with our weaknesses and he was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin, and so forth. You can't have Christ be, our human representative, the perfect human representative, and also be relate to God in a way that is utterly impossible for any non-Christ human to relate to God, right?
Yeah.
So what your providence says about how God interacts with creation is going to have implications for Christology. If God is calling all the shots with respect to creation, then what you're saying essentially is Christ's divine nature is calling all the shots for his human nature. His human side has no freedom of its own, right? There is no synergy here between divine and human. There is simply the divine saying, this is how it's going to be, and the human going along with that. And that is why I say that Molinism implies this sort of one-way relation between Christ's divinity and humanity, which amounts to a kind of, or it's implicit, or it implies Christological monophysitism, also known as Eutychianism, after a guy named Eutyches, who was one of the main proponents of this. More specifically, when people speak of monophysitism, they often break that down into two kind of sub-heresies. One is called monothelitism, and the other is monoenergism. The view that is monothelitism says that in Christ there is only one will, that is the divine will. He doesn't have a human will, which is, again, seems to agree with Molinism. The divine will, in decreeing everything that comes to pass in creation, is basically deciding everything. There's nothing left for creation to decide. So there's nothing left for the human nature of Christ to decide. His whole course of history is dictated by the divine side, right?
Yeah.
So he only has one will, and that's the divine will. That's the heresy of monothelitism. The related heresy, monoenergism, just says in Christ there is only one energetic faculty, one ability to do things, right? And that comes from his divinity. So God is basically the only active party in Christ, according to the heresy of monoenergism. Christ is energetically passive.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if you're going to affirm creaturely libertarian freedom, you can't say that. No. Right. You don't want to be a monoenergist, nor do you want to be a monothelitist.
No.
But the Molinist system, it really cannot allow Christ's human nature any leeway, and that word harkens back to our discussion of alternative possibilities at the outset, but a leeway to express itself beyond what his divine nature specifically decrees.
Because if you think of this, and this is, I want to go back to what we were saying, because if we think of what you're saying right now, and that's fascinating, because if we only take sourcehood and not alternate possibilities, then Christ is not really free, because everything is dictated by the divine nature, and he's, as a human, he has no leeway at all.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is this. So he has sourcehood, so to speak. I'm not even sure if you can say he has sourcehood though. Well, yeah, because of his divine nature, but he certainly doesn't have alternate possibilities.
Yeah. So the argument here is that if Molinism is true, then it entails a Christology that, according to the ecumenical councils, has been deemed to be heretical. Okay. Now that won't move anybody who doesn't put any stock in the ecumenical councils, but I think whether we, take the deliverances of the councils to be dogmatic or not, I think we should show them those councils considerable deference. We may not take these things to be absolute things that have to be affirmed by all Christians, but we shouldn't dismiss the councils out of hand, because these are people who are a lot closer to the apostolic tradition than we are, and there's smart people who are thinking hard about the about Christianity and what it means. We should give them some respect and some deference.
So yeah, so I'm really more of a biblicist. So the council, and I affirm diothelism. I don't affirm how do you say this in English?
Monothelitism.
I don't affirm that. I affirm
Yeah.
diothelism. Whatever. How do you say it in English? But yeah, because not because because this is what I find in Scripture. So I can agree with what you're saying. I mean, I can affirm most of the Christology up to the seventh council almost, because of this is what I find in Scripture.
Yeah.
But
the best argument in Scripture for diothelitism, the idea that Christ has two wills, a divine will and a human will, is the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane,
clearly,
right before the crucifixion, where he's praying to the Father and he says, "Not my will, but yours be done."
Clearly, I mean, I don't see how he can get around that.
If you hold a if you affirm monothelitism, then you have to say that then you wind up breaking the Trinity, because you're saying that the Son has a will that is distinct from the Father's will, and that the Son is submitting his divine will to the Father's divine will. If you go that route, then you're saying that each person in the Trinity has his own personal will that is can be at odds with the wills of the other persons. You wind up breaking the Trinity and basically turning it into a kind of tritheism.
Clearly,
which is not where we want to go. But let's switch to Tim's response to this, and then I think we'll have to wrap up this stream so we can go about our day. Or the rest of our day. All right, Christological heresy. He says this charge is just absurd. It's completely baseless. Rhoda, echoing Warren McGrew, suggests that God ordains every detail, and Christ's human nature is overridden by his divine nature. He says this objection targets theological determinism, not molinism. No, actually not. The theological determinism also entails a Christological heresy, one that is similar. It leads you to a form of Christological Apollinarianism, which says that basically in the incarnation that from the human side, all Christ gets is a human body. That the divine Son basically replaces the human rational soul. So there is, he doesn't have a human mind. He doesn't have a human will. He doesn't have a human soul. He's
basically the outside of a puppet being handled by God.
he's a human body that has been animated by the divine Son.
Exactly.
You know, so that's what you get with theological determinism. Molinism gets you something more like the heresy of monophysitism, which is where, or monothelitism / monoenergism, which is where the divine side completely dominates the human side. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily causing everything like deterministically on the human level, but it just means that the human side has no significant freedom. It can't actually, it has no leeway to do its
Correct.
own thing. And so that is where I say that Molinism is at odds. He goes on to say that Molinism requires that Christ's human nature possess libertarian freedom. Well, I mean, I agree insofar as the Molinist aims to be an orthodox, small o orthodox Christian. They're going to want to affirm this for the reason he gives, so that Christ could be genuinely tempted as we are and be our moral exemplar. But my argument, he says that Molinism preserves the integrity of both natures. My argument has been, though, that it doesn't. Yeah. Molinism can assert the integrity of both natures, but it doesn't actually maintain that integrity precisely because it affirms meticulous providence. The divine side is orchestrating everything for the human side, for the creation, for all of creation. And so the only will that has effective expression in reality is the divine will, not the creaturely will. And now this last bit, he refers to William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. Craig has defended a model that he refers to as neo-Apollinarianism. Craig has also defended monothelitism.
He has.
So Craig is a Christological heretic, doubly over. What is neo-Apollinarianism? How does it differ from just standard Apollinarianism? Well, Craig exploits the modern distinction between the conscious and the subconscious. So he says that in his neo-Apollinarianism, he wants to say Christ had a human body and a human conscious mind, but not a human subconscious. That it's at the level of the subconscious, that's where God the Son is controlling things. So consciously on the surface, Christ thinks of himself as human, but really underneath he's not. He is divine. And this is also why he's he affirms that Christ only had one will, the divine will, that it's working up through the subconscious. The divine will is basically deciding everything for the incarnate Christ. So there is no human will here. Now, according to Tim, he says that this model maintains the unity of Christ's person. That would be against Nestorianism, that divides the person, right? While preserving libertarian freedom essential to his genuine humanity. I would say no. It does maintain the unity of Christ's person. I'll grant that, but it doesn't preserve the libertarian freedom.
No, it doesn't.
Nor does it address the historical objection that was made against Apollinarianism that led to its ultimate defeat. And that objection was expressed by Gregory of Nazianzus, who was the one who headed up the Second Council, or the Council of Constantinople I, which was where the in 381 AD, which is where the Nicene Creed got its final form. They were in that council responding both to Arianism and to Apollinarianism.
Yeah.
Apollinarius was an opponent of Arianism. In that respect, they liked Apollinarianism. But then he went to the other extreme. And just as Arius had reduced the divinity of Christ, Apollinarius reduced the humanity of Christ. Christ is not quite fully human, right? For Apollinarius, Christ has a human body, but no human soul. For Neo-Apollinarianism, Christ has a human body and a human conscious mind, but lacks a human subconscious and a human will. Now, the objection that Gregory of Nazianzus raised against Apollinarius was, he said, what is not assumed in the incarnation is not healed by the incarnation. In other words, any aspect of humanity that Christ does not take on in becoming human is not something that the incarnation and the subsequent death and resurrection of Christ could heal. If Christ is going to,
I listened to Craig so many times on this because I was really a how would you say a Craigite at one point, and I disconnected completely when he taught on Christology in one of his reasonable faith classes where he was going through this thing, and I kept thinking he never addresses this argument against Apollinarianism. He never answers it satisfactorily, anyways. And it seems to me that, and even the whole disjunct about conscious, unconscious, even in psychology, everything the conscious does is because of the unconscious. The conscious is what is only the one little speck we are conscious of at every single moment. The 7 or 8 bits of information we can handle at every given time. But everything is done at the unconscious level. So this doesn't help. This doesn't help anything.
Right. So, on Craig's model, Christ does not does not assume a human subconscious psychology, right? Nor a human will. So, by the reasoning of Gregory of Nazianzus, which was adopted by the Ecumenical Council, and is that means that Christ cannot heal the human will, our fallen human will. Well, sorry, Christ can't help us with that.
The whole human psyche.
Nor can Christ heal the human mind. He can only do it on the surface, right?
Yeah.
On Craig's view, he's Christ's humanity is skin deep.
Yeah.
And so he would be open to the exact same objection that that was leveled against Apollinarius and that won the day at the Ecumenical Council, and that was reaffirmed, by either explicitly or implicitly by every other ecumenical council that came after it. Craig's view does not give us an orthodox Christology. And Molinism, I would argue, is not compatible with an orthodox Christology, even if the Molinist wants to affirm that. They're being inconsistent at some point.
Well, it does fit, as far as I can see, what you've laid out fits with both Craig's position, both of his positions on Christology. Molinism, because even
monothelitism,
even the monothelitism. I mean, if our reasoning is good, I mean, Molinism is no there's no real difference between determinism and Molinism, even if they want to call it something else. So at the end of the day, monothelism and monophysitism. What I'm mixed up with the
Monophysitism, monothelitism, and monoenergism. They kind of
so
all go hand in hand.
yes, they do.
Um, uh, uh, it took two ecumenical councils to deal with them,
Yeah,
the fifth and sixth councils. But it was the thing that you get from Christological orthodoxy, that you don't get from any of the Christological heresies, is the possibility of genuine creator-creature kind of synergy,
yeah.
where God and creation can actually work together to build something, to make something happen. And that's one thing I like about open theism, because open theism builds that idea right into the foundations of the model.
Hmm.
God deliberately decided on a world where creatures are delegated significant freedom, precisely because God wanted to build a world with his creatures, right? He wanted
Yeah,
Adam and Eve to extend the garden throughout the earth, right? And he was going to work with them to, help that process. But he wanted them to shape the world in really significant ways, alongside, and in close relationship with their creator. Uh, uh, I think that's why, an orthodox Christology is important, because if that's how we, if Christ's human nature doesn't have a human will and a human energy, that Christ can do things that haven't already been pre-approved or pre-specified by his divine side, then then uh, if either Christ has a kind, well, then Christ doesn't have a libertarian freedom, all right? And
no,
if we
exactly.
do, then he's really not our representative.
Mm.
Uh, uh, or alternatively, he does have that kind of freedom and we don't, which means also he's not really our representative. Uh,
And it's
you
very
know,
ironic that what you pointed out was that so Christ would not have redeemed the human will. So it's a double strike against the idea of libertarian free will if Christ did not have a human will, because there wouldn't be no human libertarian free will in Jesus.
mhm. Yeah,
So
yeah, there's just the divine will, right?
just a
Uh,
divine will.
yeah. Uh, so I think uh, uh, I think as we think about issues of divine providence and stuff, especially if we are Christians who aspire to be broadly orthodox in our thinking about Christology, uh, I think we ought to start giving more thought about how different models of providence are going to play out in the Christological sphere. And when you
Correct.
start doing that, I think it becomes really obvious that models like theistic determinism and Molinism are inconsistent with an orthodox Christology. I think it's also really obvious that something like process theism is incompatible with an orthodox Christology, right? The process view gets you something in the neighborhood of Christological Nestorianism, because
Hmm.
you
Correct.
have this, because you have the binary of God and creation that is irreducible, and uh, God has to allow creation its say at every point,
Hmm.
right? God can never act coercively, even when he might want to, right? And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you have no possibility for true synergy there either. It's always one side or the other has to give way, and
And it must always be the creature must always, God must always give leeway to the creature, which it doesn't seem right at
on
all.
the process view, yes,
On the process, you,
God
yeah,
has to do it by metaphysical necessity on that model. Uh,
exactly.
uh, so the creature gains true freedom, but it's a zero sum type of system where what the creature gains, God has to lose, and so. Whereas on the Calvinist model, it's just the flip side. God gains power at the creature's expense. And so there's no way to balance it out, except if you adopt an orthodox model. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things that are tricky within the orthodox
Of course,
Christology. I've
of course.
tried to articulate some of that in one of my recent blog posts, uh, but what orthodoxy is really trying to do is to find a way to balance both the divinity and the humanity of Christ without either of them sort of dominating the other, and in such a way that the two could genuinely synergize. That that's a neat trick, I mean, maybe the critics are right that you can't pull it off, but that's certainly what the Orthodox and the ecumenical councils were aiming for. I think they did pull it off, but but that's again a discussion for another day because it goes into the weeds.
It does. But hey, listen, this was where we at 2 hours and a half.
Yeah.
We beat ourselves. Last time it was less than that, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. And if you are game for eventually doing this again, I'd love the opportunity. I think we could have much to discuss. Perhaps we could come back and discuss some of the points in. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank
good thing
you.
that good thing that you muted. With all the,
Really.
but
So perhaps could come back and discuss some of the. I'm sure we'll have I think Dr. Stratton said he was going through our previous discussion and putting out a response. So perhaps what we could do is, when the response does come out, we could perhaps get together and check this over.
okay, I'd be interested to see what he comes up with. Uh, I just sort of based on the initial sort of back and forth between myself and him, I expect he's going to largely miss the point of the criticisms, but we'll see. I don't want
Hey,
to.
no, and
Uh, you
exactly.
know,
He might surprise us, and I'm sure uh, we tried to be as fair as possible in Steelman Molinism as much as possible.
yeah, I don't think we've taken any cheap shots against
I don't
Molinism.
think so. Perhaps I did a couple of comments that might have been less than gracious, but if not, I think we really gave it a good shot, a good representation, and I think both of us were Molinists at one point.
Hmm.
So I was Molinist for a while also, and
Yeah.
well, I toured with it for maybe a couple of years when I was a Craigite,
Hmm.
and so we both know the system rather well, but I'm sure. Well, I'm pretty sure that Dr. Stratton will give us the same and try and steelman our own arguments against his.
Guess we'll wait and see then. Anyway, I've enjoyed it, and I hope your stream uh, gains traction with a wider audience.
Well,
And
the last time it didn't get traction on the stream per se, but it failed rather well in terms of views afterwards, and it was rather interesting how it did afterwards. So I think a few Molinists listen to it, which is good. It furthers the discussion and helps us to better understand each other.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
So listen, Dr. Rhoda, thank you again so much, and looking forward to another discussion with you, my friend.
All right. Looking forward to do. God bless you, Pat.
God bless you.